Right. Well, I think it's hold on. Manoush is not here, so we'll start. I think it is 12:45. Welcome, everybody. This is the fifth evidence session of the Commission on State Fragility, Growth and Development. We've covered conflict. We've covered state capacity, the ability of countries to get things done. We've covered state legitimacy, how to build legitimate institutions that people trust. Yesterday we had a session, very good session, on private sector development, and today is the issue of resilience. I want to welcome our five evidence givers. Thank you very much for your written submissions, which were excellent and really helpful and punchy. I think in terms of what we're trying to do this afternoon is, obviously we all understand that the basic contention of this entire commission is that trying to help fragile states is going to become more important, because pretty soon half the world's poor are going to be living in fragile states. And obviously fragile states are more prone to shocks and less resilient. Low resilience is both a cause of fragility and a consequence of it, so I don't think we have to worry too much about the causation. We know this is a problem, and we're asking the question, what can we do about it? We had a very good session this morning with academics who are bringing us up to date with the latest academic thinking on this. I think the way I would summarise it is there are problems of how we can try and predict shocks, how we can try and adapt to deal with shocks, how we can strengthen countries and institutions so they cope with shocks, how we can help them and us and others respond to shocks, and fifth, how we can ensure and find mechanisms to help them ensure against shocks in order to be more resilient. I think I'm going to ask each one of you to speak for 5 minutes, and I have got a stopwatch just in case. I'm pretty liberal, but if it goes on too much, then I'll bring you to a close. I think where we've got to go to excellent submissions, and assume we've all read them, because I know we have. Where we're really going today is, I think, trying to ask, in these areas of predicting, adapting, strengthening, responding, ensuring, what is it that works? What doesn't work? The institutions here that have got direct experience of it, what stops you doing more of what needs to be done in these situations? It's getting right down to the brass tacks. Understanding all the problems and difficulties of doing these things, but nonetheless, with a commission like this, trying to give us the best real-world examples of things that have worked, that haven't worked, so we can understand the nature of the problem and the potential solutions. Right, that's enough from me. Our witnesses are Debbie Hillier from Oxfam, Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor, warm welcome. You'll be going first. Herbert McLeod, Country Director for Sierra Leone and Liberia International Growth Centre. We've got Peter Sands, foreman of Standard Chartered, Chair of the World Bank's International Working Group on Financing Pandemic Preparedness. And I think you can give us some lessons learnt on Ebola, how handled and things we can learn from that. Clare Shakya, from the Director of Climate Change, International Institute for Environment and Development, welcome. And Dr. Albert Zeufack, Chief Economist for Africa, World Bank. Great to have you with us. Let's start with you, Debbie. Welcome.
Thank you very much. You've given us a real challenge to talk about resilience to shocks in fragile states in 5 minutes, so I don't quite know how it's going to work. But I guess there's lots of Oxfam stories that I could tell, but just one to start off with. I spent 4 months in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Goma, and during that 4-month period, the volcano erupted a little bit, and lots of ash fell down, killed all the grass, the goats ate the grass, the milk became poisonous. So livelihoods issues. A boat overturned on the lake, 150 people killed. Everyone knew someone that had been affected by that. There was a cholera outbreak, people in hospital, people were locked in the hospital until they paid their hospital bills. And then, of course, the background of the conflict. And this is what people have to cope with on an everyday basis in places like this. So I just wanted to kind of touch on what real life is like for real people, the communities that Oxfam works with. So 5 issues I want to raise very quickly. First one is about equity. I think a lot of the discussion about risk and resilience can get quite technical. We can be talking about water harvesting or governance, and it all sounds very technical and rational and sensible thought processes. But actually a lot of it is about power and politics, and sometimes that gets kind of lost in this debate. Risk can be framed as a sort of natural and inescapable factor of life. We all face risks, whether you're a hedge fund manager or a farmer in Malawi, and we all just have to manage them and deal with them. And perhaps if people have the financial tools, savings, insurance, credit, they can become more resilient. But it's not as simple as that, because actually the poor people, vulnerability is not a random kind of twist of fate. Inequality is hardwired into crises, and risk is dumped on poor people. So at the international level, we see this through climate change particularly, and at national level, we see this as well as big businesses, local elites and powerful groups kind of dominate resources, manipulate institutions to get what they want out of it. And inevitably, it's the poor that suffer. So I think we need to look a bit harder at equity, make sure power and politics is very much a part of decisions about risk management, because I don't often see that in the discussions that I'm in. And leading on from that, then, gender is the other big piece of this. Women are disproportionately affected by risks of all sorts. So obviously they have very specific health risks. They're more vulnerable to divorce and abandonment. They have fewer options economically. Obviously violence has more impact. And these factors in normal times are aggravated then by crises of whatever description. And women are often less able to participate in decision making that actually affects their risk and resilience. And yet women have such a potential to reduce and manage risk at household, community and national level. So to build resilience to shocks, we really need to mobilise and support women's agency and empowerment, because women can bridge differences in religions and ethnicity, class and rural-urban divisions. Thirdly, just more broadly around managing disaster risk, how do we do that? And it's obvious, but it is the state's responsibility to provide assistance when people's capacity to cope has been eroded or exceeded. So the state is the chief duty bearer of disaster risk and has the moral and legal obligation. So the things that a state needs to do to provide, so they need to provide an ex-ante approach to risk reduction, to risk management rather, so reduce risk, have an active process of dealing with crises that will occur in the next sort of few years. They need to provide social protection, so people have a safety net. The most vulnerable have a safety net. And then I would say shock responsive systems, making sure that the systems that they do have are scalable. There's some really interesting work happening at the moment around shock responsive social protection, so systems that can scale up and scale down as crises occur and then fade away. And I'd like to see more around shock responsive health systems and education systems and nutrition, because the reality is that crises will happen and there will need to be flexibility and changing of national systems. Of course, all of that is very hard to do in a fragile state. So I think in a fragile state where there are some forms of state institutions, then bringing state and civil society together to build trust and social cohesion is key in helping to make those services work. And where there really aren't any state structures, or they don't function, or there's no legitimacy, then working through other social and faith networks can be very powerful to provide some of the services and security that the state really should be doing. But bottom line, I think, is that resilience in conflict can only be built through bottom-up empowerment and respect for the rights of women and men most affected by risk. Fourthly, I don't know how I'm doing for time, community-based protection is something that Oxfam has been doing for quite a while, particularly in the DRC, but elsewhere as well. And protection is obviously around preventing, limiting or mitigating the impacts of abuses. And there's a certain level of work that has to happen at kind of the higher sort of legal level, but this doesn't often impact on people's daily lives. So what Oxfam does is we work with a lot of communities on the ground to help improve their day-to-day protection issues. So we set up protection committees who look at all the issues affecting protection in that specific community. It's very context specific, all of this stuff, and develop a plan and work with the local authorities, whoever they may be, to help achieve some of those asks. And the core premise is that when a community understands its rights better and then can talk to the local authorities, again, whoever they may be, about those rights, then sort of solutions can be found. So some of the work that's done, so for example, in Lebanon, we have one community decided to pay for a generator to provide lighting for latrines because women were felt unsafe around the latrine area. Another group in DRC negotiated with a local armed groups around extracting bribes for people that sort of passers-by. So that's the kind of day-to-day work. It doesn't change the conflict, but it does help to reduce the burden of life of people living in conflict and provide some measure of hope and dignity. And I think as well as that kind of day-to-day solving of protection problems, building up communities' understanding of their rights and how they should relate to a state, I think is a useful skill for once those states do eventually become more effective. So it has a long-term impact as well. And finally, my last point, the need for change for aid and the international community. Resilience programmes need to clearly link between the two poles of humanitarian and development. And at the risk of oversimplifying, humanitarians are good at risk and development experts are good at power and governance, but we really need to bring these two together. Development thinking has sometimes, often, been a little bit blind to the shocks and stresses that and uncertainties that poor people face, and naive in assuming that development happens in a basically stable environment. So there's a long-term programming, whether that's of government or of donors or the banks, needs to internalise the shocks and hazards that will happen and enable programmes to kind of scale up and down as appropriate. Now, this is starting to shift. There's this new way of working between the UN and the World Bank and others, which I think is very good, but I think there's still a long way to go. You know, if you look at a map of Ethiopia, essentially all the development programmes are down one side and all the humanitarian work happens somewhere else. There's just not a crossover between the two. The long-term development work needs to reduce risk for poor people as well as support economic development. And these programmes need to be flexible and adaptive because there are no easy solutions. There is no log frame that you can follow in a complex and environment that's subject to shocks. And then one final thing is around, I think, early humanitarian response to forecast crises. This is actually the easy bit. You know, if you can see a drought coming, 3 or 4 months down the line, why wait until people are actively hungry before responding? And yet that's exactly what we do. The humanitarian community is not well set up to prevent crises, and the development community, it's not really on their radar. So there's a real easy win here of early response to forecast crises, which would reduce humanitarian costs, which would prevent human suffering and avoid development losses too.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to come back to you and do questions on that, definitely, for the how, who, when and what needs to change to deliver it. But thank you very much. Right, next we're going to hear from Herbert McLeod, Country Director for Sierra Leone and Liberia International Growth Centre, two countries that need great resilience. Herbert, welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about Sierra Leone, but my observations apply in many respects to the DRC, where I spent some time during the period of the transition. Resilience, when one talks about resilience, one is immediately talking about long-term strategies, long-term actions. And quite often resilience is referred to primarily in terms of the immediate alleviation of issues. In some instances, not always. There are 4 areas that I want to address. The first is that to understand or to actually design sustainable programs that would lead to resilience requires a proper diagnosis of the problem. And in the case of Sierra Leone, it's political history that eventually shaped its economic trajectory. Sierra Leone was never accepted as a state from the word go. So you had a contested state, you had issues of legitimacy, and you had issues of parallel or informal states within the state. And those states were the traditional cultural systems in place to maintain law and order and provide for the citizens. That was not dismantled during indirect rule, so it continued. And decisions, therefore, were made once the politicians realized you could use it for power, for entrenching your power. Decisions were made primarily through these informal states, and the contested state was just a shell. And I can talk about that later, how that shaped the economic trajectory. The second point I want to make is that for countries in post-conflict, or that have just experienced conflict, it seems that there is almost always an agenda for recreating the political and economic systems preceding the war or the conflict. So the agenda is very simple: silence the guns, get humanitarian aid to morph into development assistance, undertake general elections, and fund a transition agenda. Unfortunately, that may well be successful, and to a large extent is successful in Sierra Leone, but we now see that it has reproduced the exact conditions that led to the conflict in the first place. There may be mitigating circumstances. For example, if we found oil, you could paper over some of those cracks in the foundations of the state. The third point is private sector. There's always the feeling that if we can pump in a lot of foreign direct investment and to some extent as well direct aid, that everything will work out, jobs will be created and so on. Forgetting that it is a double-edged sword. It's inevitably, especially for natural resource-based economies, it's a double-edged sword because it creates inequalities. It leads to exclusionary arrangements both at the economic, social, and political sphere. So it does not necessarily engender resilience without accompanying factors that should manage these inadvertent consequences. And then the next one is development partners. Development partners, I would nicely say, inadvertently reinforce fragility through projects that are, I'm afraid I have to use the word imposed. I know everybody will say, but you had the right to refuse. But when you consider the conditions in which the aid is advanced, and when you consider that you have absolutely no coordination is a word. I used to be a resident coordinator, so I know what I'm talking about. You have a country that is just emerging from conflict without capacity. Most of the good guys, when I say good, the trained guys, the qualified guys, they get jobs elsewhere. So we are left with people who are not in a position always to argue against policies that are suggested, backed by millions of dollars. I know you might say it's a soft option I'm taking, but that's the reality. And I have several examples where for example, I give you one example where for Ebola, there was a post-Ebola recovery program developed by the international community. IMF, World Bank, UN, everybody worked together to produce a post-Ebola recovery for the 3 countries, for the sub-region. That post-Ebola recovery included learning the lessons of the past. What happened immediately after it was accepted in New York, a powerful donor came in and said, no, what you should do is presidential priority program. Here is X million dollars, bam. Presidential priority program. Nobody talks about the post-Ebola recovery package anymore. And so we lost the opportunity of applying lessons, which was, by the way, the second time we lost the opportunity of applying lessons of the past. The first time, I should have mentioned, is the peace process. When the peace process was done, and this was true equally for the DRC, I was there. In the case of the DRC, you had two commissions. There was I don't remember exactly the names. One was the political and one was the economic. The economic was led by Johnson Sirleaf. Run out of time? Almost?
Nearly.
Okay. Johnson Sirleaf completely forgotten the economic. Everybody focused on the political. Let's get the elections going. Let's get the humanitarian program morphing into development program, and you forgot the second part, which is absolutely necessary to sustain and change. To change first and to sustain the new state. Let me end here.
Thank you very much indeed. We're now going to hear from Peter Sands on pandemic preparedness and lessons learned.
Yeah.
Well,
if I may, I'll broaden it slightly. What I really want to talk about is the importance of health systems in devising strategies to deal with fragile states. This is partly about resilience, because where you have a dysfunctional health system, as we saw in West Africa, we're seeing in Yemen at the moment, we're also seeing in Syria, countries are uniquely, particularly vulnerable to infectious disease outbreaks. But it's important to note that it's also about underlying capacity of the state, because they are also suffering far greater disease burdens from endemic diseases, such as malaria, TB, and so on, and from non-communicable disease threats. So about a third of maternal deaths and about half of infant deaths are in fragile states. So it's a resilience issue, but it's just a basic ongoing state capacity issue. The argument is that I would argue that this is one of the biggest sort of downsides for the people living in fragile states, is the fact that the health system collapses or becomes dysfunctional. There's loads of stats on it. I think the most stunning one is the work that's been done that has shown that in post-conflict states, the deaths from the collapse of the health system as a result of the conflict are greater than the deaths between combatants fighting each other. And there's quite a lot of evidence of that. Secondly, that you do get these quite powerful interactions between different sorts of crises. So in Haiti, you had the interaction between the earthquake and the strain it put on the health system, which contributed to the cholera outbreak being poorly controlled. And you get these complex interactions where diseases often play a very powerful role. And the response strategies are rarely well integrated. The third point is that if you are trying to rebuild or recover the economy of a fragile state, one of the most powerful ways that that plan can get knocked off course is through some sort of infectious disease problem. It is incredibly difficult to develop an economy when you're busy fighting an epidemic or pandemic, and the West African example is a very powerful one of that. The cumulative GDP loss of Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone is kind of double digit. I mean, it's a massive dislocation of economic activity. This is also an issue when it comes to restoring security. 80% of the attrition rate in the Afghan armed forces was deemed due to poor health. This led the US actually to develop a healthcare system specifically for the Afghan armed forces, because they saw it as being a massive sort of undermining factor of the capability of the armed forces. Looking more broadly, if you're sort of looking at it perhaps less from a sort of altruistic or humanitarian perspective, but from a sort of more of the self-interest of the advanced economies, one of the ways in which fragile states can most powerfully impact the rest of the world is frankly by being an area in which infectious diseases can gain scale and momentum. And that makes them far harder to control. And if you look at any of the maps that are being developed of what some people dub spark risk, where there might be outbreaks, they're all concentrated in the, a lot of them are concentrated in the most fragile states in the world. And this is because most of these things you can control if you have disease surveillance systems and response capabilities. Most Ebola outbreaks have been limited to being sort of 10 to 15 cases. It didn't happen when it broke out in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. So the question is, why aren't we doing better? And what can we do about it? I think that health system support in fragile states falls into a kind of uncomfortable place between the reasonable and sort of by their own light sensible objectives of different kinds of actors. So the development community actually tends to find it very difficult to operate as governance and security deteriorates in countries. And actually, there's pretty robust evidence that the amount of development assistance for health goes down in countries with poor governance and security problems relative to countries at similar income levels. And it's all about worries about corruption, diversion of monies, tracking impact and all that sort of stuff. NGOs often get involved in these situations. and this is caricatures because there's many exceptions to the rule, but on the whole, the NGOs are focused on dealing with the immediate consequences of whatever the crisis is. They find it very difficult to actually be building longer-term health systems, things like national disease surveillance systems, laboratory networks and things. Most of them are not set up to provide that kind of support. And when you have sort of military security type interventions, whether it's through the UN peacekeeping or NATO or bilaterally, there are very varying levels of awareness and involvement from military leaders of the importance of health issues. You do have situations where, for example, in Afghanistan, there were elements of the Afghan health system which USAID was not prepared to support for all the issues of sort of corruption and diversion of monies and so on, which DOD, the Department of Defense, ended up supporting. But that is an unusual. In most cases, the military side of it is relatively unaware of the importance of health assets. And to give you another example, in Kosovo, a large chunk of all the health records of the country were destroyed. And they weren't seen as a critical asset in the same way that other kind of physical assets were seen as critical assets that had to be protected by NATO. So what are the kinds of things that we need to do? I think the first thing, and this is where I think this commission could play a huge role, is just elevate the importance of health systems as being an absolutely critical element of any integrated plan towards supporting fragile states. Partly because if it doesn't work, it's probably the driver of the biggest human cost, and secondly, if you don't have it, it's going to derail everything else you're trying to do, and thirdly, because it isn't working at the moment. I think one of the most difficult things we have to do is we have to get more comfortable about providing on-budget financial support, i.e. providing money through health ministries, which is a very difficult thing for development agencies to get comfortable with in environments where you don't quite know where the money's going, the tracking mechanisms are limited and all that sort of stuff. But if you aren't building institutional capability, you won't get a health system. You'll get bits and pieces of support. Secondly, is we have to find better ways of monitoring health system capability. One of the problems that development agencies have in this space is they don't know whether they're making any difference. And so we need sort of better metrics of performance and better metrics of vulnerability. We need people who are coming in from a security perspective or military perspective to be better informed and better integrated in the way they think about these things. And as I say, there's a spectrum here, but for example, in many of these situations, they have a list of critical infrastructure assets that they prioritize to protect. We need some key health assets in there, and they are often quite invisible things like disease surveillance systems. The final thing I would mention is health workers. No health system can operate without health workers, and in almost every one of these situations, health workers are either in flight or they get hired by the NGOs. In some cases, they get actively targeted by competent forces. And it's critically important to find some way both of arresting the diminution of health worker capacity and working out how to build it over the longer term. So those are just some thoughts of some of the things that can be done now.
Thank you, that was excellent, really helpful. Right, Clara is next, Director of Climate Change International Institute for Environment and Development. Welcome.
Great. So some of the themes that have come up already are going to be reiterated in my 6 points. So first of all, that the sort of top-down bureaucratic blueprint approach to our development programming, and I put up my hand and say I was part of it, has not worked in many geographies. In many locations, the complexity it's impossible to get the foresight to design things well enough in highly variable climates. So irrigation schemes, whether that's in the Sahel or Ethiopia, have been largely loss-making and have excluded large numbers of people from land that they've been traditionally using. if you look at traditional approaches to the sort of, generation after generation of learning to survive and thrive in those types of contexts, it's been about chasing nutrient pockets with the pastoralists, transferring fertility and wealth through mobility and reciprocity and trade with the agricultural south. So in the Sahel, we have a strong story of actually the development interventions reducing the resilience of the communities themselves, and a lot of people losing out. If you take another context of flood-prone areas in South Asia, the development paradigm has been about trying to control the flooding, dredging rivers, building embankments, and a huge amount of rents coming from that process of earth moving. And now looking at actually what the vernacular approaches were, living with the floods, raising critical assets and welcoming the nutrients that flooding provides, is actually now being reinvented in Europe. We're now talking about room for the river. This is very much the Dutch approach and now being replicated across Europe. So with very large investments, you need good foresight. And in very complex, very highly variable geographies, you get to a level of false precision, where the only way the engineer can understand the climate is they begin to create averages, and then you lose the variability. Smaller investments are faster, more flexible. So even in South Asia now, they're moving to think about cascades of smaller dams, or, for example, in the renewable energy space, thinking about off-grid distributed systems rather than large sort of control and deliver. So how can we draw those lessons from that sort of messy mosaic approach to rethink actually how do we deliver development in these types of these types of contexts? So where complex systems, where the normal is in fact disequilibrium, how can we begin to characterise what works, responding rapidly to when things are going well and flexing when things are going poorly? So you're mining opportunities as they arise with good weather, with a good harvest, and able to respond and expect bad weather. The characteristics are around being robust to shocks. It's thinking through redundancy and how you allow safe failure. It's thinking about agility and flexible institutions. Institutional capabilities have come up already, and rapid adaptive learning. And it's about thinking about the fundamentals of poverty, tenure and property rights, voice of women and other excluded groups, and how we can build a more inclusive process. The third aspect is that it's just getting harder. We've only got 1 degree of warming. It's been an incredible year for climate shocks. But the reality is the very nature of rain is changing. We're all noticing this, but it's hard to capture it in the way that we capture rainfall, because it's about intensity per minute rather than about rainfall over a day. It's just the incredible intensity of rainfall. And we're seeing much less of the slow misting type rain that we used to get that really allows germination. We're also beginning to see in places in Nepal, for example, where because of the elevation, the speed of climate change is happening much faster, that already crops and pollinators are out of sync, that we're no longer getting the pollinators arrive at the time that the trees are flowering, for example. So that's making foresight even more challenging, and it's hard to adapt at this pace of change, and we need therefore to rethink how we do our development investments. Knowing that in the fourth point, the roots of conflict and insecurity in the Sahel, the Horn and South Asia has been the sense of being forgotten, that no services, not benefiting from investments where they're being made, and communities feeling a sense of they have to manage on their own. So that's the norm, but there have been islands of good governance. And I think that's where we have to, where's that positive deviance happening and why is it happening? So what we've been seeing in IIED is that where local institutions have been supported and given authority to make rules for resource use and finance to invest in local priorities, you're beginning to see a shift, and you see a much more resilient response to a period of conflict. So in the Maoist uprising in Nepal, where I worked during that period, that sense of exclusion was being made all the more strong because of the very rapid social and environmental change going on at the time. And the islands of good governance that emerged were the where communities have been given rights to the use of forests, which gave them the resources and the authority, and importantly, the institutional agility to invest in services and the infrastructure as needed. And the Maoists actually welcomed the forest user groups. They saw that as a positive model of development, but so did the development actors, so did state government. So it was the one place where it all came together. In the Sahel, where we're now seeing large tracts where the state is absent, it's often the only groups actually maintaining peace are customary leaders and rural associations who are trying to strengthen collective governance over resources for which their livelihoods depend. So if we take that process of that sort of positive deviance and begin thinking about how we invest in resilient economies that cope with risk and vulnerabilities as an effective response to jihadist recruitment, we need to begin to expand these approaches. And this, we would propose, is around devolving finance, because with finance comes possibility. Enabling local institutions to build new social contracts at the local level, dialogue between local communities, local governments around how best to use the resources that they have, both the land use rights and the finance coming down, to really invest behind the most resilient opportunities. We need mechanisms that can respond quickly. This is something Debbie was talking about. And with new digital technologies, we can see huge opportunities for much faster responses. Cash transfers over a mobile phone, or communities letting governments know where there's an outbreak of conflict. Opportunities to really rethink the process around how communities are supported in response to a shock, like stocking or destocking mechanisms, rather than thinking about food transfers. So in the places like the Sahel, the Horn, or the mountains and floodplains of South Asia, we would propose that we need to reimagine these locations, not as stories of scarcity and degradation, but of ingenious communities exploiting climate variability and unpredictability, and really think through how we back and support agile and responsive mechanisms that reach communities and support their strategies in meaningful ways. And that's fundamentally about tackling the roots of poverty, so tenure rights, inclusion and voice.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful. Plenty to come back on there. Right, Dr. Zeufack, finally, your contribution, Chief Economist for Africa World Bank.
Thank you very much. My name is Zeufack, and I've learned to make King speaking last an asset. So thank you so much. It's a challenge speaking, being the last speaker. It's a challenge speaking after all the very, very, brilliant interventions. But let me first say that the evidence I'm going to share here builds on some analytical work and research work that is supported by my office, and from work that has just been completed by the World Bank and the UN, and that has just been published under the report Pathways for Peace, Inclusive Approaches to Prevent Conflict. So I would like to make three broad points. The first is that we need to better understand the link between economic shocks and the risk of violent conflict. And in that exercise, it's really important to distinguish between the risk factors and the triggers of violent conflict. I think these are clearly two sets of factors we need to identify. In terms of risk factors, I think political exclusion has been identified in analytical work as being one of the most important risk factors. Economic grievances do also affect the risk of violent conflict, and concerns over justice and security are also important. In terms of triggers of violent conflict, political transitions happen to be the most important trigger point. And economic shocks as well are proving to be extremely important, especially when they are disruptives. And events such as Ebola have also exposed the failure of institutions in a way that has actually raised the awareness of citizens and increase the probability of that becoming a trigger point. So, second point I want to make is that, in analyzing, resilience, we need to focus on the life cycle of resilience instead of focusing uniquely on the time that the shock hits. If you take the example of economic shocks, if you look at the commodity price collapse, for example, and how it affected fragile countries, it is clear that we now have evidence, empirical evidence, that the effect of commodity price shock has had a negative impact on conflict, and there is a clear relationship between commodity price collapse and conflict onset. So, what is actually quite important though is that good policies can mitigate those risks. What we find is that, in case of commodity price collapse, if countries implement counter-cyclical fiscal policies, which means they actually increase their public spending instead of cutting them, the risk goes down. So the question is then, how do we help fragile countries building the buffers that would allow them to implement that counter-cyclical fiscal policy? So the focus on the pre-shock period is frankly as important as focusing on the crisis itself if we are to ensure resilience. So this is even more important for natural resource rich countries, which tend to actually have a very, very pro-cyclical fiscal policy, increase public spending when commodity prices are extremely high. So working with these countries to ensure that policy, fiscal buffers are built is critical. Now, the third point I would like to make is, on why it is important to look at economic institutions as a way to maintain confidence in national institutions. What we have noticed is that, in periods prior to crisis, we do have a deterioration of macro and fiscal, indicators that then make it difficult for countries to adjust. One of the most difficult, tasks in fragile countries, is that it's difficult to mobilize policy response after the shock. And this is even more difficult when, in the period prior to the crisis, macro stability has not been maintained. So it's actually very, very important to ensure macro stability, macro and fiscal stability. In terms of determinants of resilience, what we are learning from this work is basically that we have to distinguish between the short and long-term impact. What is important is that the period preceding the violent conflict is very similar to the period preceding an economic crisis. We do see an increase in inflation. We see an increase in deficit in countries, in fragile countries preceding the crisis. Now, in the medium term, medium to long term, I think we have to give heightened attention to countries with natural resources that are being contested outside an agreed policy framework, but also countries where we see macroeconomic spillovers arising from competition between social groups that is being managed through populist policies. So we have to also track slow-moving warning signs of future conflict, such as high aid dependence, low domestic revenue mobilization, and subsidies with narrow set of beneficiaries. So for international institutions, this means that our financing should look to address vested interest and capture of resource rents and subsidies before it gets too late to take on this agenda. So now let me just close by saying that in Africa, the most relevant phase for many countries is preventing relapse. Most countries currently in violent conflict have experienced violent conflict before, and the 2011 World Development Report has clearly established that the biggest determinant of conflict occurrence is having had conflict before. So how do we prevent relapse is probably a question that we should certainly focus on. So let me stop here.
No, thank you very much indeed. Those are excellent presentations. We've got all the commissioners here with lots of expertise from all sorts of different institutions and places. But I'm going to cheat as chairman and just ask one question to each person to get it going, and then others can pile in. So we'll start with you, Debbie. One thing I was rather intrigued by, you said you thought an easy win was disaster response, and how I think that's what we're talking about, humanitarian disaster response. And this has been talked about a lot for how it could be better arranged and more automatic, but it never seems to happen. What is the easy win?
So the easy win is that, and this is more difficult for conflict, okay? But if we're looking at natural hazards and we can see a crisis coming several months down the track, as humanitarians, we are programmed to respond to acute needs and to prioritise on the basis of need. So if there is an urgent need in one country, that's where we tend to prioritise. And if we can see a need, tomorrow's need, well, that will have to do till tomorrow. So humanitarians tend not to focus on prevention or on early response. But when the crisis is there, then we're piling, we know what to do.
Where would you put this? Is this a particular bit of the UN, or who is it a combination of different USAID and other NGOs that need to be brought together, or is it some other bit of architecture? Or is it just an attitudinal change?
I think it needs a change in incentives. Humanitarians need to be rewarded, if you like, for preventing crises rather than just responding. I don't think decision makers in donors in the UN are rewarded for preventing crises. It's very easy to get some credit if you have responded well to a crisis. It's very easy. It's hard if you've prevented a crisis from happening. So I think there are some real incentive issues, and then I think there are some financing issues. Humanitarian money has to be spent on a response. Development in a short time frame. Development money has a long term, and it's very inflexible. What we're looking at is something in the middle, in between these two. So I think it's all possible, but I think there are some kind of structural problems, and it does, as you said, I think it's a change in mindset and a decision that it could be quite easy. This is something that we can achieve, and as I said, what the result of that would be a reduction in overall humanitarian spend. If we respond early, then it reduces the impact. It'll be a reduction in human suffering, and actually also a reduction in development losses. If the drought gets so bad that everyone's livestock have died, then people have no livelihoods. There's nowhere to pick up, when the rains come again. So there is a huge loss. So if we respond early, so I think this is something that can be done, but I don't think it's had the political impetus to actually bring everyone together, because it's not an easy nut to crack, but it is crackable, and bring people together and address it properly.
Yes.
Can I just interrogate that point a little further? I mean, does Oxfam actively do prediction of the kind you say needs to be done so that you can anticipate crises? If not, is it such a global public good that there needs to be some body set up that senses a global monitoring body that is trying to trigger support when it's needed? I think if we're going to say the system is failing, we also, I think it's beholden us to say what is the thing we need to do to fix the system. And I'm not immediately seeing, because it needs to be global, I'm guessing. It needs to cut across any specific responsibility of any one institution, be it a relief institution or a development assistance institution. I mean, do you have a sense of what the...
Like what the WHO is meant to do for health, but clearly failed in the area of
Yes.
Ebola.
Do you have
Do
any
you have an
ideas
alternative?
on that?
Early
Yes.
warning
Good.
system.
Yeah, so there are a number of early warning systems. So the World Meteorological Office obviously does the climatic stuff, and then you get the FAO, which does the agricultural kind of side. So what is the impact of the weather on the seasons and the harvest? At the moment, that isn't quite coming together. So, you know, there's a lot of expertise in both of those two places. But at the moment, I think the two sides aren't talking to each other enough. And again, I think that's overcomable. I think just the sort of institutional mandates need to be, or perhaps there's something over the top of both of them, or underneath both of them, perhaps, to draw it together into some kind of system that all actors could respond to. And then, of course, and that's at the global level. And then there's also the regional climate centres as well, and then of course the national one. So it is a kind of cascading system. I don't know whether Clare has sort of views on that at all from your sort of climate perspective.
Well, there was an attempt actually in DFID in the run up to the drought in the Horn to inform, better provide climate information to the development to their country offices, so that people were more able to predict and prepare. And one of the biggest issues was actually the type of finance that was available, that actually the development actors had already programmed all their finance and they didn't have a pot, there wasn't a contingency pot. Now, for the UK government to hold a large contingency pot for early response of this nature is actually quite an expensive thing. It's considered an unproductive use of budget. So that's one of the issues. I think it's about how you measure, how you might want to think about how a separate piece of finance is considered required, or earmarked for that, or in some way consider the value of it in a different way so that it's not considered unproductive to have contingency finance able to respond in this way. We've been doing a lot of work, Debbie and I have been a part of talking about this around risk finance and how you can use insurance markets, but the reality is that can only come in for quite a high risk event, otherwise it's just too expensive. A high, infrequent event.
Okay. Yes, Manu.
It's interesting. This conversation reminds me a little bit of the debate we had in central banks about preventing financial crises and who's responsible for looking at the systemic risks and trying to preempt them before banks go bust. And in the end, the conclusion was, unless you assigned clear accountability, unless there was something called the Financial Policy Committee for dealing with systemic risk, it just fell through the cracks. It doesn't happen. And so I think, clarity about who's responsible for doing this and setting aside resources to do it.
I agree. I'm surprised that if there really is a problem, which I think there is, of no one is there coordinating the prediction and the alleviation of a forthcoming drought or failure of the harvest, whatever. I'm surprised someone hasn't, or maybe they have, written something about how the current UN setup, which is you've got your political departments and your humanitarian departments, but there's nothing doing this, that there's a sort of structural response that's required.
There was, sorry to intervene, but there was an attempt in the run-up to the last World Humanitarian Summit to do exactly that, and to require, it was called the Grand Bargain, I think, was it? Basically the UN is set up in a way that they compete with each other for particular roles, and it was very hard to unpack and change the dynamics.
But we're not limited by those, consider we can, look to the stars. Good, that's very helpful. That's really... Any other questions? I've got one other question I wanted, a sort of technical one, which I'll go ahead with, which was, you talked about shock-responsive systems. I'm not sure I understood what they were.
So let me give you the example of Kenya. This is the poster child for the shock-responsive social protection system. So in 4 regions of northern Kenya, so the poorest regions of northern Kenya, they have something called the Hunger Safety Net Programme, in which everybody who lives in those 4 regions of Kenya has been assessed for their level of poverty and income, and everyone has a kind of credit card. And so the poorest people will get a payout every month. So that's a regular social protection system. Every month, the poorest will get a payout every month. When there is a drought, or potentially flooding, but usually droughts, which are affecting those regions, that will therefore push other people into increased vulnerability. And what the system does is, using a kind of objective metric on weather, on drought, it will scale up that social protection. So people who were getting a regular amount of, I can't remember the number, sort of $20 a month, will get a bit more, and or people who weren't getting anything, who who were felt to be above the poverty line would now get a payout because they are perceived to be now vulnerable because of the drought.
And is it a government-delivered programme?
Yes, supported very much and funded by DFID initially. But it is very much a government-owned system.
That's important, that comes back to the state capacity and capability.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
But what it allows is a very quick scaling up and down of the social protection system, and I think it's very, in terms of just what we were talking about, how do we respond early to shocks? Well, this is precisely how you can respond earlier. If you have a sort of national system or sub-regional system that can scale up and down, you don't need then the humanitarian actors to pile in because you've already got a system that can scale up and down.
And you said you'd like to expand that to education and health. Could you say a bit more about how you?
Yeah, so I think Concern, which is an NGO, another NGO, they have looked at how to scale up nutrition systems because, again, in a system like that, you're going to have people who weren't vulnerable who are now vulnerable. But if you have national services that are not able to cope with more malnourished children, then again you'll need to have to pile in the humanitarians. So again, if we can find a way that national systems for health and education are more flexible, that have a more flexible element to them, then they can respond much more quickly than a sort of external humanitarian help coming in. And sort of supporting an existing system is much quicker and much cheaper, assuming it's reasonably effective, than setting up a parallel humanitarian system which will be there for a few months, which doesn't really understand the context or the communities.
Paul?
I just wanted to build on that. So we know that nutritionally the real damage is done to very little children during times of stress. That sounds as if it could very easily be linked into that information system. Is it already there, or is it?
I'm not sure. I'd have to find out and get back to you on that one.
But presumably this is an area where, with the development of the ease of apps and technology and more people banking on their mobile phones and all, this is a scalable, expandable sort of program that you could put into other areas which are all about resilience. Brilliant, really good. Any other questions for Debbie? You might want to come in on some of the stuff we do later on, but that's okay. Well, let's go on to questions to her. But I'll kick off. I was very struck by the point you made about development partners imposing projects that may make things worse. And you started giving an example about the post-Ebola recovery plan. I just want to understand a bit more detail about either that example or another example of where that sort of action can make things worse and why. And also just to understand the mechanics of that dominant donor. Who was it and why and how did it come about? The television cameras on. We don't seem to be on any television channel you've heard of, so you're quite safe. You be as frank as you like. But I think that's a really important point you made, and we need to understand why.
Well, I thought I also explained the why. When the government does not have capacity to be able to argue a case, it's the classic repetition of the structural adjustment programs of the 80s, where the IMF's policies were quote-unquote imposed because there were no strong enough alternatives to counter the arguments. So the inadvertent result in this case is that in the program which was developed with a consensus of views from international community, you had a section dealing with, among other things, applying the lessons from Ebola. One of the lessons, for example, is that this was not just a health issue, that fundamentally there was a systems failure, but that these systems failure were there before, but they were papered over as a result of resources, etc., being available. So let me give you the case of decentralization. So in that case, in the document applying the lessons of Ebola, we had a whole section dealing with decentralization, that you needed to go back to basics on decentralization to ensure that at the community level and at the district level, people can take decisions rapidly. It didn't happen in the DRC, paradoxically, because the DRC is decentralized. The government just doesn't have the capacity to know what the hell is going on in the district, so people can take immediate action. But in a case where you have some form of centralized authority, this led to a reproduction of all the dysfunctionalities at the center at the community level that allowed Ebola to explode. So here was a lesson which we thought was so important that any program going forward must handle. And yet here was a donor that went on to presidential priorities that focused on let's get the wells back, let's get the schools back, again, essentially reproducing the agenda of a post-conflict country. Go back to where you were in the beginning.
And the dominant donor?
I forgot the name.
But they would have to be
Well, I don't mean
David,
we still need to hear
chip
about it.
in.
This issue of donor agendas driving what happens is very prevalent in health, because what you see in health is a lot of disease-specific interventions. So it's Ebola, it's HIV/AIDS, it's malaria, it's TB, or a particular focus on a particular population, so maternal health. And it's very hard to argue with any of these things. But what you then end up with is a local health system that is a collection of sort of project-specific projects. And I'm afraid to say they've learned that if they want money, they have an AMR plan, or they have a malaria plan.
It's just like government here, exactly the
Yeah.
same way. You go to where the money is. You know, everyone suddenly had a cyber security plan because that's where the money was.
Exactly, but what it means is you don't have a system,
Yes.
and sort of things fall between the gaps, and it becomes quite kind of unstable, particularly in environments where actually there are more projects than there are skilled people. You get a very fragile environment.
So linking this to the more general argument about state fragility is that you need to focus on building the health system rather than simply building elements of it. And so going back to the lesson, I just wanted to bring both of you on the sort of Ebola lessons. You would both agree that the argument there was greater resilience would come in the future from building the health system rather than simply targeting how to handle a particular disease.
Absolutely. But, I mean, you need the Ebola response, but you also need basic primary, general practice. You need a basic disease surveillance system that allows you to pick up disease incidents coming up in different places. And you need a system that produces nurses and doctors in reasonable numbers.
While we're on Ebola, I'll open up the questions to everyone else. Just please do it.
While I agree with you that this is possible, if the underlying factors that's responsible for the health system not to function effectively remain, then even that doesn't work.
Yeah,
in other words,
indeed,
we've got to
yeah.
look at the underlying reasons why all the systems, health in this case, it may well be early warning system in another case. And when we know when all the signs are that there is likely to be a drought or there will be an invasion of armyworms or something like that, but if that system is not functioning, we're going to have the same problem.
Just while we're on Ebola, can I just ask you, Peter, with the work you've done with looking back at it, something that struck me at the time was, as you said in your evidence very strongly, most outbreaks have been 10 to 15 cases and then they've been brought under control. In this instance, that didn't happen. The early warning system didn't work, and in my view, the WHO, which should be part of the early warning system, was very slow off the mark. Is that right? And if it's the case, what would you do to the WHO, or what other early warning systems would you put in place? That is a key question on resilience against pandemic diseases. What's the answer?
Well, to start with, we were disappointed with the WHO because it didn't do something actually that we hadn't asked it to do. Because the WHO doesn't really have a broad spread on the ground operational capability in many countries, right? It has small offices who are basically providing technical assistance and norms. And that is what the member states have funded it to do. It had an emergency response budget in 2014 that was less than the city of New York's. And so it just was, so absolutely the WHO did not do a good job on responding to it, but the reasons it didn't do a good job are pretty easy to see. The conclusion, because before I did this thing, I chaired something for the National Academy of Medicine in the US, an international commission looking at the lessons from Ebola. The first line of defense for any infectious disease outbreak has to be the national health system. And it's really basic things like, do you have a basic system that allows you to pick up the incidence of different diseases in different parts of the country so that you can look at patterns and see when something is going wrong? Do you have basic diagnostic capabilities so that you can actually tell what disease it is that is happening? And then do you have some kind of responsive capabilities and basic disciplines like infection control in the hospitals and all that sort of stuff? If you don't have those things, then frankly you can have the WHO being as good as you want, but the time it sort of gets to the WHO and that is already too late. So the first line of defense has to be preparedness at a national level. One of the big steps forward since Ebola has been the development of a thing called the Joint External Evaluation, or JEE, which is a peer-reviewed objective process of assessment across a whole bunch of indicators by other public health officials from other countries of any one country's capabilities in this arena. If it has a drawback, it has two drawbacks. One drawback is that it's voluntary, and there are varying levels of enthusiasm for participating in it. The second drawback is that it's a little unclear what happens after you've done your JEE. So about 30 or 40 countries have now done a JEE, and only a couple of them have costed plans to fix the problems that have been identified. And that was very much the objective of the group I chaired for the World Bank, is to sort of focus on that problem as how do we actually go from having a diagnostic, which is what the JEE is. But to answer your question about the sort of the global capabilities like the WHO, the WHO now has an emergency program in a way that it didn't have, which is a significant step forward. I think its financing is not sustainable. It's financed as a project, which seems very odd as a global institutional capability. And there has been work done, but I think there is still work to be done to improve the coordination between WHO and other international entities. Because what you got in West Africa with the Ebola thing was a pretty confusing muddle of different agencies and bilateral involvement, the US and the UK and the French, and you got OCHA, and it wasn't a smoothly run operation by any means. And I think there's a lot of learning about how you coordinate global response. But it comes back to by far the best in infectious diseases, probably even more than natural disasters, because infectious diseases, what's the difference between a small thing and a big thing is how prepared you are. Spending money on preparedness is what you've got to do.
Questions to Herbert or to Peter, because we're moving between the two. Tim?
Yeah, I have a general question, something I was reflecting on. Partly Manoush talked about the analogy between some of what we're talking about and the response to the financial crisis and the kinds of reforms we put in place, the G20 and the Bank of International Settlement. It strikes me, and it's just a conjecture, that the global community, when it comes to the kind of issues we're talking about, is much less good at coming together, learning the lessons, and trying to think what the institutional response has to be. I mean, Herbert talked in the context of Sierra Leone about the lack of capacity to learn the lessons, and therefore to put in place those things that mean this doesn't recur. Now, again, it comes down to, well, we can diagnose that problem all day long, but what is the way of trying to institutionalize better solutions that actually learn from what happened with Ebola, whatever is the relevant example, and pull them together? Maybe you need commissions like this, but we won't have any capacity but to recommend ideas. We need bodies that can really act, not just talk.
I mean, I
There's probably one for...
I think the reason the response on the financial crisis was greater was because it affected the advanced economies themselves, and they paid a heavy price, whereas this is a little bit far away.
I think there's an element of that. I also think the problem with commissions, and I realise I'm talking to a commission, and I've chaired commissions myself, is they're ad hoc, and you need to systematise things, and also, frankly, you need to turn things into dollars. And dollar risks. I mean, one of the reasons we paid so much attention to the financial crisis is because it hit economics in a very hard way. One of the things I've been pushing is the notion that we need to take the economic risks, and this is not to discount the human life risk, but we need to take the economic risks of health crises much more seriously. And if we do so, and we do so in an institutionalized fashion, it'll start getting us thinking. So for example, I've been trying to persuade the IMF, your old shop, to include health risks in Article 4 assessments, which they do not. And actually, we did an analysis. We looked at 15 countries that had had health crises. And we said, in the 2 years before, did the Article 4 assessments ever mention health risks? And in the 2 years after, did they regard the crisis that had happened as being relevant to the macroeconomy? And the result was 0% of them looked at them before, and 63% of them regarded them as macro-relevant afterwards. Now, if you think 2/3 of the time that it was macro-relevant after the event, it does kind of slightly raise the question of why you wouldn't think the possibility of it happening is also. But I think we need to institutionalize these kinds of things, because otherwise you will only get ad hoc responses to them.
Other questions? I want to come back to on two things. Just on this respective importance for resilience against pandemics of the role of the nation state and the role of the WHO. I mean, of course, you need every country to have, as you've just described, good procedures in place and the technology in place to measure and monitor and all the rest of it. But isn't it the case that part of the problem with pandemics is you're often getting new strains of avian flu or new strains of Ebola and all the rest of it? And it seemed to me at the time that the weakness of the WHO was that you need a sort of crack team of epidemiologists or whatever they're called to fly in and help out the country. Do you think that what they put in place at the sort of disaster handling end, which you just described, is that sufficient to do what I've just said? Or are we over-relying on countries that inevitably are going to struggle to have, asking some of these countries to have the laboratories and the expertise and all the rest of it permanently in place for new strains of incredibly complicated things that we haven't even thought of? It's always going to be tough, isn't it?
It's basically you need three different things to be different to have a better global defense system against the threat of infectious diseases. One is you need a basic set of capabilities at country level. Of the kind I described, disease surveillance and so on. And when I say labs, frankly, the higher category of labs, they can be shared on a region. There's lots of stuff going on in Africa about sharing Category 4 labs and things like this, because you don't need one in every country. Then you need the global capabilities. The technical assistance from the WHO and so on is hugely important, because it does provide training, ability to understand new strains, all that kind of thing. I would say what they've got is a massive improvement. My big question is there the broader political commitment to finance it? Because at the moment it's not on the sustain. The way the WHO works is, you may know, is that the actual core funding of the WHO hasn't changed for, I think, about 18 years. And everything else is funded on a project basis. Which, when you're thinking about longer-term sort of capabilities, isn't a very stable way of doing it. And then the third thing you need R&D spend on some of these things, which, because they're not necessarily highly prevalent in advanced economies, aren't naturally going to be the things that private companies are going to sort of race towards. And in a sense, you need all three to be functioning to have an effective defense system.
Thank you. The next question, totally unrelated, was something you said got my interest. You made the point that under your bit, why aren't we doing better? Development community cannot act as governance and security decline. Indeed, often aid spending goes down. What lessons do you draw of the consequence of that?
Well, I think this is...
it's like the heart of what we're trying to work out, but I thought while we got you here, I might as well ask you the difficult question.
Yeah. I say this with great sympathy for people who run things like DFID and USAID and so on, because I think they're often in a very difficult position from their own domestic political point of view. But the reality is that if you're going to help build institutional capability in states with poor governance and difficult situations, you have to take some risks. You have to take risk-based decisions, and you will know that some of the money may end up not being in quite the place you wanted it to be, and some of the projects you try and finance will sort of go wrong. And that's a very difficult thing to do. You know, if it doesn't want to end up on the front page of the Daily Mail the next day, that's a very difficult thing to do. But the consequences of saying we're not going to give money unless we can have a sort of, highly traceable audit of every dollar, and we know exactly what the measurable metrics of impact are, particularly with something like health systems, because a lot of what you're doing with health systems is stopping bad things happen. It's the sort of incentive stuff about it's the disease that didn't happen, the outbreak that didn't. So it's quite hard to kind of prove the impact on that. And so I think we need to create, and this is where political leadership needs to create an environment in which it's acceptable to make those risk-based trade-offs. What's interesting is that the military is typically quite used to making risk-based trade-offs, which is why you've had these situations, particularly in the US environment, where the DoD has stepped in and done things in the health arena which the aid agencies have not been prepared to do.
To be fair, DFID did used to finance budget support on budget health systems. And it's the political pendulum has swung.
I wasn't going to, I mean, that's a subject we're going to have to discuss as a commission, because it's the pendulum swings one way and then the other, and there are good arguments both ways. But you made your point very clearly. Other questions to Peter or Herbert, or should we move on? We were meant to be stopping for coffee, but I think we're going to just punch through and finish the session and let you all go a bit early. We can have a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, but I think we're making good progress. Other questions, or should we go on to Clara and look at my fellow commissioners, or indeed our academic experts who have stayed on? Thank you very much. Please.
One observation on the Ebola crisis, which is that one task is to have early warnings that are accurate, and we've had a discussion of where that ought to be located. The second task is that resources need to be deployed off of that information in an orderly way. What happened in the U.S. was, for example, we have the Centers for Disease Control. They have fantastic expertise. They were obliged to pitch the number 1.4 million as their projection of the number of Ebola cases in those three countries. I don't think there was a plausible model of behavior they could possibly have gotten there. And to say that publicly, why did they do it? Because they were facing Congress, and they had, on an absolutely discretionary basis, to get their hand into Congress's pocket and get the funding. So I'm just saying there are two separate issues here. One is accurate information, and the other is a structure that somehow takes the allocations out of the political space to some degree. Otherwise, the information that gets put forward is always going to be too urgent, and that has collateral damage, as you can well imagine. As soon as people see that number, their behavior changes and the economic costs get higher.
If I could just jump in on that. On the monitoring aspect, there's a lot of work going on in the infectious disease space around pandemics, around what kind of ongoing monitoring should be done and who should be doing it. And I would distinguish a number of different elements of it. One is what I would call intrinsic risk, which is looking at different parts of the world. Are the diseases present? Are the vectors present? What's the spark risk of a new or existing infection? And that's probably the one where most progress is being made at the moment. It's also the one which is most, in a sense, technical and least political. A second level of monitoring is the monitoring around institutional capability of preparedness and response, both at a national level and at a global level. And the JE is a good example that they look at. There, there is recognized to be a need for that. It's a much more political space because you have to be able to say, is the WHO doing a good enough job? Is the World Bank doing a good enough job? Are individual local governments? And there, the discussion is, what's the structure, the independence of any monitoring effort that allows it to sort of have credibility on this? And then the other probably one of the most difficult ones is this issue about economic impact. Because the economic impact of these things is not usually a direct function of the actual pathogen. It's a function of the fear attached, and so you need to be able to model behavioural reaction. And so if you take something like Zika, Zika from an actual morbidity and mortality impact was, however horrible the microcephaly, actually relatively limited in numbers from a global scale. But the economic impact was much, much broader than that because people started changing behavior very quickly. So I think one has to unpick the monitoring things, particularly around the dimension of the sort of the political nature of the monitoring, because that can get quite difficult.
And Paul, then we'll move on. Oh, sorry, and Nick. Mary.
I have a question for Herbert. So one argument that people often make for countries like Sierra Leone not being prepared for disasters is weak state capacity, so which prevent practically most of the things from most of the actions from being taken. So what kind of like priority policy actions would you see for countries like Sierra Leone to prepare for disasters, which are feasible despite weak state capacity, and which over a time also strengthen those state capacity?
Very good question.
Yeah, well, quite often capacity is used to hide a lot of things. So one, it's always good to break it down into what we mean really by state capacity in the context of preventing disasters. Not preventing disasters, but actually warning about them, monitoring, and therefore being able to control. And that goes back to a question which was raised about what do we need to equip these countries with, the kind of laboratory systems, etc. That's the ideal, but before getting to the ideal, there are little steps that can be taken now, and firstly, it is to help countries look at the current structures that exist for health delivery. Just analyze it in the sense of not how many more hospitals you need, but how it is functioning or not functioning, why it is not functioning. Inevitably, at least in the case of Sierra Leone, and to some extent too in the case of the DRC, the explanation can be traced to the political governance in place that encourages impunity, corruption, the patronage, so that even the nurses who are appointed at the community level have no business being in a clinic. Those are little steps, but very important steps in ensuring that at least one is able to get the kind of quality information that you need at that level. Beyond that, I'm afraid one has to just build up the institutions of government as a whole. Again, I go back to, in the case of Sierra Leone, we are having difficulty in getting institutions to function because of the same reasons. Patronage. If the government can hire and fire the Chief Justice, when a case goes, it's not too difficult for somebody from the government to advise whether a certain judge should look at the case or should not look at the case. So when you begin to erode the system of the justice system in the country, and there's no credibility there, everything else goes down, including even the functioning of an ombudsman. If I have a problem with the government, I can't go to the ombudsman, or can I go to the ombudsman and expect a fair treatment? So I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but it all goes back to, I think, I should have mentioned that I see for the first time the World Bank is getting into that space. I hope that the IMF too will get into that space of identifying, diagnosing a problem for what it is. There's a draft report which is not yet finalized, but where I see the World Bank saying that we are going to remain fragile unless some strong measures are taken in the governance space. So whether we like it or not, we have to invade that space if we want. Otherwise, we are just putting technical solutions on a flawed foundation.
Okay, so can I just answer that question in a very slightly different way? So I think in terms of looking at disaster risk, I think there are certain things that a state has to do. So there needs to be a kind of national, risk management plan. But then I do think a lot of the activity needs to happen at the local level. So an interesting example, I know it's not a fragile state, is the Philippines, which has clearly a lot of natural hazards and a very strong DRR plan. And one of the features of that is that some of the budget at the national level goes down to the local level for disaster risk management activities at the local level, and it is at the local level that the decisions are made on what to spend that on, whether it's hurricane prevention, whether it's evacuation, or whatever it might be. So, because I do think it's really important that risks are felt at the local level, and that actually it's very contextual, and what those risks are will be felt by different people in different ways, and you cannot have a national policy that can really help to reduce risk at the local level. It has to be about people in the end. And if I may, just one small story about Oxfam. There was a tropical storm in Honduras a few years ago. Oxfam went in with its humanitarian kind of approach, and we did water and sanitation and cash transfers, and sort of dealt with the immediate outbreak of the tropical storm. But actually, the real problem there was due to agribusiness, because some sugar and melon plantations had been set up. People had been pushed off their land, and then those plantations had used water in different ways, so the water management had changed, and then they'd hired people from over the border from Guatemala. So the local people there no longer had land and no longer had a way of having an income. So Oxfam had come in and we'd done our humanitarian bit, but actually that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was actually around lack of livelihoods due to, in fact, that was around decision making around land tenure, which is something that Clare mentioned. But you don't understand that until you're actually there, talking to people and you see the risk that people face. So just want to get a bit more of a bottom-up focus around risk management.
Okay, Paul.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic both to the decentralised, to the local community, and to Herbert's point that focus on the really central things that are going wrong, like patronage and the fundamentals of the rule of law. And I just want to tie it into, we were here yesterday focusing on private sector development, and what the private sector guys told us was we need you to advise on strengthens the state capacity in the interface with the private sector. And that sounded very sensible. Private sector needs the state, and we need to strengthen that bit of the state. And then here we are today, and what we're told is, actually, for healthcare, what we need is the state. Can you strengthen the bit of the state that functions for healthcare? And the only problem is that our commission is about fragile states, and one of the fundamentals of fragile states is there's very little state capacity, right? And so we have to come up with, to find solutions which radically economise on the need for state capacity, because there isn't much and you can't build it very fast. And so we need to yes, the absolute standard is going to be we need a better state than we got. We know that, but let's start from reality of where we are, not if only. And so we need to look for ways that really radically economise on the need for state improvement. Yeah? Now, I absolutely buy into the patronage thing. We also got testimony from on Afghanistan, from some deep knowledge of Afghanistan. He said there's only 100% achievement in Afghanistan, and that is 100% of teachers have got their jobs through patronage. And so, you're trying to build an education system in Afghanistan. Start from the problem that it's patronage all the way down. What can we do? Just a couple of thoughts. One is, I think, the decentralization shift. So maybe we don't. And your story, that in a way the Sierra Leone state was a bit too strong. If only it had been DRC, it wouldn't have been there to stop the decentralization. And then then I just wonder whether this sort of DevTech solutions coming up that enable a sort of bypass, really, of the whole traditional diagnostics, whether we can get, just as we can now read weather on the ground from satellites without having a national weather forecasting agency, is there anything we can do equivalent in the health sphere? And then finally, one other thing that came up yesterday, where we talked a lot about private sector in Sierra Leone and the catastrophe of Ebola. And for the private sector, what they said, the catastrophe of Ebola was nothing to do with the health risks. The health thing was just a bit of a sideshow, actually. The real economic disaster of Ebola in Sierra Leone was the media coverage, the media response. And from Steve, I hear one of the reasons for the media response was actually a US agency that then came out with this massively inflated number. In a way, that's predictable, isn't it? But maybe we should also be predicting the news management of these things, because if they were right yesterday, the mismanagement of the news was the big crisis, really. Sorry, that went on.
No, that was really helpful. I mean, we had the same thing. The numbers that our experts were telling us about Ebola were off the charts. And I don't blame them, actually, because if you looked at the early stages of the disease, once it got past the 10 to 15 and it was in the hundreds, if you looked at the growth of it, it was unchecked. It might well have been. And that's the stat, I think it's hard to blame them for coming up with a big number, because if nothing had happened, I mean, I think, frankly, if some of the international action that hadn't happened, we might have seen that take place. So that's a broader debate. We shouldn't get into that now. Right, Mary, and then I'm going to move on to the next.
Yeah, so quick question to you each, coming off the back of what Paul was saying. We have sort of two buckets of solutions to fragile states, and one is institution building, capacity building, long-term governance, because we know that correlates in the end to great outcomes, and the other is the emergency humanitarian assistance in the crisis to try to stop people dying. And I guess for us, it's what we're trying to work out is, where does one of those get in the way of the other, and what are the obstacles that you can take out of the way? And Debbie you gave us an example of where the humanitarian assistance system doesn't think enough about prevention. And I wondered if you've got an example the other way of where it is that the institution builders are getting in the way of your humanitarian response. And I wondered from Peter, you've given a passionate argument for systems building in a crisis. Where is it that you think emergency responses to pandemics are getting in the way of building health systems in the way that you described? And similarly, for Herbert, where do you think the sweet spot is? Where is it, you rightly said so often the donors are doing things which are governance eroding and capacity eroding. So could you give us one example of where they intervene, which is actually capacity or institution strengthening, if there's anyone that comes to mind, and perhaps our later speakers would have ideas for us on this as well.
Great, very good, thank you. Right, Debbie, go first.
I'm not sure I can think of an example where sort of the development actors have got in the way. I think it's more a complete lack of interest is the problem, and that while that's the humanitarian job, that's not our space. We don't do that. We'll just sit here and wait for the humanitarians to come in, and we'll just let them do their thing and not talk to them. And we do our thing over here, and they do their thing over there. I think that's the real problem. There might be some examples where there have been blockages, but I think the main problem is the lack of coordination. And I think, as I said before, you know, humanitarian action can be incredibly good and absolutely life-saving, but it's very short term. It has very, you know, it does think very short term. It's a kind of a little bit in and out, and it doesn't have the sort of, it's not around institution building. That's not what it does. And even in countries like the DRC, where there's been humanitarian action for 20 years, that's not in and out. That's actually been constant. But it's kind of short-termism. It doesn't think long-term. It can't. You know, it's annual budgets. It's sort of, you know, the sort of average humanitarian project is 6, 9, 12 months. We don't think long-term like the development people. And so...
But are you saying the development people are too absent, too slow, and too disconnected from you?
Yes, and looking, just not incorporating a risk into their thinking. You know, the classic kind of development log frame, you'll have a column which has the risks, you know, what might derail this project, well, conflict or drought or flooding. But then it sits in that column. They don't do anything with it, it just sits there. So that then if there is drought or conflict or flooding, they say, well, we didn't achieve our project, but, you know, that's because of the drought and the conflict and the flooding. And actually what they need to do is kind of bring it into the thinking and make their programmes much more flexible and adaptive.
That's very clear. I wanted Peter to answer that's very well put. Peter, examples where emergency action has got in the way of capacity building in health.
There are lots of on-the-ground examples, because what you end up having is very, very focused interventions dealing with a particular problem, and all the resource gets sucked into. There's some, I don't have the percentage off the top of my head, but the main hospital in Port-au-Prince in Haiti lost over half its medical staff to NGOs and agencies working on response to the earthquake, which is, it was all good stuff to be doing, but from a point of view of this was the major hospital in the capital city, was denuded of capability.
But that's brilliant. I mean, if we're looking for do's and don'ts of resilience, that's a very good specific example.
Then the other issue is that what you see in both national and international responses to the threat of infectious diseases is what Jim Kim described as the cycle of panic and neglect. So something happens, huge amounts of attention paid to it, and then it goes off the sort of political agenda, and then everybody... The question is, how do you use that point of attention? And the problem is that if I look at in the wake of the Ebola epidemic, is that too much of the political capital and the window was used to talk about response things. A contingency fund for the WHO, the PEF at the World Bank. I would even argue some of the sort of R&D stuff. If I look at that relative to the, in a sense, bang for the buck you would have got by talking about really basic capabilities at a national level around disease surveillance, diagnostics, and so on, that window of opportunity to sort of change the dial with the oxygen got used up by the response stuff rather than by the boring stuff. The analogy I always use is people always prefer to talk about glossy and, you know, fire engines than they do about fire retardant materials and all that sort of stuff. And yet, as we know all too well, the sort of boring nitty gritty stuff really matters.
The counter to that, as someone who was in the panic and response part, is, you know, we could do something about the response part. That was within the power of Britain, America, France, you know, to sort of sharpen up the response end. We couldn't guarantee that countries would put in the fire retardant material. So you always have a judgment about what is within your control to do, and therefore it is your responsibility, and what might be a better option, but it's not. You can't actually physically make it happen.
No, and I fully respect that. Actually, in the heat of the moment, the response of countries like the UK and the US was actually really important. And I think we have to be very careful on this line of people made exaggerated forecasts and they never happened. I mean, this happened with the H1N1, and you know, various people kind of lost their jobs and stuff because of it. These outcomes would happen if you didn't intervene. It is really important to intervene and not to criticise for people for saying if you hadn't intervened it would have been a much bigger number. So I completely I just think one needs to move very rapidly in these situations to thinking about the preparedness element of it and making sure that you capitalize on the political window.
Very quickly,
Yeah, before responding to that, I'm not so sure that the development partner cannot influence, because during a crisis, virtually everything that development partners say are accepted, because the government would have lost credibility, and they're just too happy to say this was done. This was.
I was talking about after the crisis. Okay. I was talking about after the crisis.
Yeah, okay.
You know, I think Peter's point is we probably spent too much time tooling up the WHO and getting ready for the next emergency at the sort of international level, rather than putting capacity into health systems elsewhere. I think that's the point you're making, and I was just putting the counter that maybe that's true, but on the other hand, you know, the developed countries had a set of things they knew they could do themselves.
Yes, levers you could actually
levers you could pull. Right, sorry, Herbert.
Now, you know that conflicts at the community level in mineral-dependent countries surrounding extraction is also a source of instability and exacerbates fragility. Well, in one example is Sierra Leone, where the combined work of DFID and World Bank actually made some major reforms take place in the mineral sector. That is now very, very active, I would say successfully, dealing with community issues that otherwise could have blown out of proportion.
Great. Let's move on to Clare. I'll kick off with a question. I mean, it's rather a general question, I suppose, and I might be being unfair, but I just wondered whether, listening to you, I thought it was a slightly counsel of despair that in developing countries, your argument is that small bottom-up projects and ways of living with the consequences of climate change and other things are better than larger projects that might put these countries on a different path of growth. And I just wondered whether that's really correct. I mean, you said in some ways it's the Dutch approach to living with the floods. Well, the Dutch approach is not to live with the floods. The Dutch approach is to build bloody great barriers, to dredge every river, and when we got the Dutch over after the flooding of the Somerset levels, and they looked at us and said, "You're mad. This is a totally man-made environment. You've done nothing to protect it. You should be dredging your rivers and streams and building bigger bunds and banks." And if we didn't do that in Holland, the whole place would be permanently underwater. So are we living by one rule ourselves and asking people in developing countries to live by a different set of rules, which actually will condemn them to less of a chance of transformational economic development? And yes, of course, some dam projects and others have been badly conceived and designed, but that doesn't mean that large projects can't make a big difference to communities.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I'm not saying that there isn't a role for intervention, and let's just take the flood example. What I suspect the Dutch was telling us was protect your critical assets. So where you've got an electricity station, have it high enough that it doesn't get affected by the floods, which is something we, the UK, have been advising South Asia for a long time, but failed to do it ourselves. In terms of what's a productive system, actually analysis that has been done over decades now is showing that pastoralism is 50% more productive than ranching, that it returns profits in similar locations to cotton farming, when cotton farming is making a loss, but cotton is well subsidised, so survives. So I don't think that what we're proposing is saying that there isn't a productive opportunity there. It's about a different way of thinking about how you get the finance to the opportunity. So if you put the finance in the hands of local governments in collaboration with local communities, then the sets of things that they invest in are different, developing distributed capabilities rather than centralised capabilities. And I think this is the response I'd make also to you, Paul, that that state capacity at the very central level it does take a very long time to respond. But if you start working with all the elements of government, which is a lot of actors at the local level, you can actually begin to build that capability faster. The devolved funds that we're working, 4 countries we're working with currently, but 5 over the last 5 years, the process of that is at scale. It's a national scheme in Nepal. It's a third of the country in Kenya. It's growing to be a third of the country in Mali. And what we're seeing is that the change in dynamic is significant. You still have technical inputs by government experts, but the community's in control of deciding actually where that finance goes. They get advice, but they're not. It's not the government in holding the reins, as it were. And you begin to see a shift in dynamic and a very different set of investments being made, small distributed investments. The communities in Mali are putting their own money into solar household systems. They're putting this shared pots into water protection, not necessarily increasing the number of water holes, but actually protecting those that exist and agreeing the rules around access of them. And it's having a substantial and rapid effect on their ability to cope with drought. So I think it's not about the top-down model being completely broken. It's about recognising that actually at the moment, we think only 10% of climate finance is committed with the objective of getting it to the front line. And if we change that dynamic, so it was 80% getting to the front line and 20% on state central capabilities, we think we'd see a big increase in resilience. So it's shifting the dial on where the finance decisions get made.
Paul?
I just wanted to come back on to Peter, really. And pick up, Minouche had this great example of when it was financial instability, we did something about it, and healthy. But I was just thinking of the euro crisis, and what was done about the euro crisis in the end was Draghi saying,
Whatever it
simple,
takes.
we're going to do whatever it takes.
Yeah.
And Peter's proper comeback to me was to say, damn it, without the panic, nothing would have happened. But my point is, the panic was really damaging. And so there needs to be some response which allays panic rather than amplifies panic. And so we sort of need the equivalent of pandemic level to that sort of statement, whatever it takes. And then, then there has to be something behind it, obviously. It has to be
Draghi's got a
credible.
big balance sheet behind
Yeah,
it.
the WHO don't have the capability of...
But that's, as it were, is avoiding a global pandemic, it's obviously not as important as saving the euro, but it's still not negligible.
Much easier.
And so we need that equivalent of whatever it takes.
Yeah, and at the moment you don't have an organisation. Even after the changes that have been done to the WHO, it is not funded or constitutionally set up in a way to play Draghi's role in any remotely. It's not set up in that way at all.
But some of it is leadership too. I mean, it could have played a different role with different leadership, probably.
Yeah, I think you could argue a lot of. On a number of dimensions, whether it's leadership, organizational capability, funding, governance structure, these are all problems that afflict the WHO.
Tim, and then we'll keep pressing on.
I just want to link it back to the climate change challenges, because I mean the kinds of risks now that people are going to be assessing is a huge, in countries that are unable to cope with the consequences of climate change, the deterrent to private capital investment is going to be just massive if countries are fundamentally deemed in that. But yet we don't really have, again, in most places, any kind of credible strategy in a lot of particularly fragile states for dealing with the consequences of that. And it's really linking it back to our discussion yesterday. It's one of the fundamental things that's going to make some places in the world almost a no-go for global capital to flow, private capital to flow to those locations. So it really is at the core of, I mean, we if we know anything from the research on investment, that uncertainty is one of the biggest deterrents to private investment. And this form of uncertainty and knowing how to deal with this is fun. I'm not, as you see, coming up with any answers, but I do think it's fundamental to the kinds of issues we're dealing with.
So just on that, I was just very recently at a meeting of the least developed countries on their energy plans under the Paris Agreement. They've got they've got the authority, if you like, to set out their plans of how they're going to really invest in energy, and in theory the northern countries are going to help fund their plans. And when we were getting really into the nitty-gritty, it was a group of LDC experts. They were from their countries, not all government, many of them government. We were sitting down and really working through what is it that will attract private investment, because there is no way there's enough public investment to begin to address the energy access gap that they're facing. And fundamentally, it comes down to multi-stakeholder approaches and recognising the number of different agents that are out there, and the ways that actually that there is a certain set, or a very limited, in fact, set of things that the government needs to do in order to make it a more attractive investment environment. But there are so many fundamental, processes needed in setting up projects, doing the design and all the rest of it. It's a kind of all hands on deck. So beginning to think about it less about that central government capability, in which there's probably one or two guys sitting in a renewable energy agency that are meant to be coming up with all these plans, and thinking much more about how can you build community-led mini grids design, how can you get NGOs involved in supporting solar household systems, sort of becoming more known and understood what the good models are. There's a whole range of actors that are out there, and it's about crowding that capability in with a common purpose, rather than expecting a single government official to be able to orchestrate the whole lot. It's this lack of coordination.
But going back to our conversation yesterday, it was undoubtedly true that decentralised energy systems and solar and LED lighting and all the rest of it is going to deliver light and power to many more people around the world in a green way, and that's wonderful. But if you're looking to see the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises that need access to some sort of electricity grid, you've also got to have the other part of the picture as well. So I think it's both those things. Let me just move the questions on to Albert, and then we can have a round up with any other questions people have got. Yeah, you mentioned two things that caught my attention. One was you said we do have a better way now of tracking signs of conflict. And we were listening to our academics this morning who said that there wasn't really a lot of predictive work, that because obviously we'd do better at resilience if we could see the conflicts coming in states. And I think you made some reference that there was now a more effective way of looking at indicators. And the second thing, sort of linked to that, was this link you drew between commodity price shocks and conflicts. And you said there were now some clear examples and evidence. And I just wanted to draw you out on what they were, because it wasn't immediately apparent to me.
First of all, let me say we've been working with my colleague Aguirre, building on his paper, published in 2016 in the Journal of African Economies, to really investigate this relationship between commodity price collapse and conflict. So we do have, from his most recent work, empirical evidence that the commodity price shock has actually increased the risk of violent conflict, and that work has actually further elaborated the need to focus on economic shocks as triggers for conflict. So the evidence I cited is essentially from the work Aguirre has done, building on that paper of last year, but a new paper which is now a World Bank working paper. Okay. Yeah, so there's some evidence there that across fragile countries that we have studied.
As a consequence of that, would you change the behaviour of the World Bank and the IMF and others, presumably, if there was a clear evidential link? If you want to support counter-cyclical economic policies and the rest?
Absolutely. If that evidence is it's further strengthened by further studies, I think it's important to start wondering how we create those fiscal buffers for fragile countries to keep investing or keep spending when there is a shock of that magnitude. So the situation is extremely difficult because you cannot be expecting fragile countries to be raising more revenues in that situation. Hence the role of helping them better managing good times, but also the role of aid.
And do you have a particular, we were looking this morning, the academics were helping us at the various mechanisms that have been used over the years. There was an EU fund that stepped in and helped commodity dependent countries.
Stebex, yeah.
You've also had there are insurance systems, there's the pooling of risk, there's all sorts of different ways it can be done. Do you have a emerging favourite?
Well, the Stebex was effective in the 80s, mostly for the agricultural price, shocks. I'm not sure if we have actually been able to put something of that sort for oil and mineral prices. So, it's certainly an area where we could look further into. But I don't think we have proper mechanism now to ensure those countries. If you take the CEMAC countries, those in Central Africa, at this point in time, which are all oil dependent. I mean, the collapse of oil prices from $110 to $45 has actually completely, put those economies at most of them are close to being bankrupt. So, and I'm following those quite closely. And what is happening now is that they have to really go through very tough fiscal adjustment, which for countries like Central African Republic, which is in that CEMAC zone, and a fragile country, may exacerbate those risks of conflict, because the fiscal adjustment is actually, scaling down spending instead of actually continuing to invest. And now let me probably speak of how do you actually invest in those contexts. And as I said earlier, from my perspective, investing to avoid the risk of relapse is where we probably need to focus a little bit more. And what I've done, I used to manage a macro program for East Africa and the Great Lakes with a number of fragile countries. And one thing I've noticed is that growth booms are very, very short-lived in most of these fragile countries. So we need to manage expectations of growth, of peace dividends. Because the moment the conflict ends and the peace comes back, people would expect to feel right away, benefits of peace. So we need to probably focus a little bit on how do we, ensure people do not raise expectation too much. And the second point is on the role of jobs. How do we ensure jobs are created in those environments to actually, ensure that the combatant, the ex-combatant, actually have something to do instead of sitting with your Kalashnikovs and waiting to start another coup. And to that, let me just share one thing the World Bank has tried recently. It's using the army to actually start building infrastructure in fragile areas. That hasn't been done as part of it's actually very difficult to do that in our rules, but we've just done that for northern Cameroon, where Boko Haram has actually been destabilizing the whole economy. So can we think of actually drawing a little bit more on the army for programs of public works and using a little bit more their skills to create those jobs in an environment where the private sector wouldn't move right away because, peace is still extremely fragile.
Tim?
Yeah, just coming. I mean, I'm full of admiration for the World Bank, but I'm very concerned that the World Bank is, given its structure, its governance, and its objectives, is really able to play the role you're describing. Now, of course, traditionally it would be the IMF. I mean, the World Bank played around with budget support in the 80s, got heavily burned. The political economy of that was very, very difficult. So it tried to go back to more project-based finance, which had been its original its original mandate. But either way, whether it's the World Bank or IMF, there's a kind of set of issues around how it can structure its interventions, both to be timely and consistent with its broader mandate. I'm not sure we certainly don't want to be in the business of creating yet another institution, but I do think I think for the World Bank to be playing the role, it's not set up right now. Interestingly, the case I know quite well is the EBRD. So what happened post financial crisis, there was a big risk that there was going to be an economic collapse in certain strategically important countries in Eastern Europe. And the EBRD was basically asked to start doling out budget support to countries to stop a reversal, basically end of democracy and the kinds of stuff that might have happened if that had all unraveled. But the politics was just phenomenally difficult. If it hadn't been for the literally gun to the head situation of the financial crisis, that would probably never have happened. But there were various decisions, key decisions. So I like very much the idea that that one key role is strategic lending and budget support. I'm just not convinced the World Bank is set up to do this. Now, you need to reassure me that it can do it at scale and in the right way.
Last few questions to anybody, from anybody. So, Manoush.
I mean, the IMF does have a facility for counter-cyclical support in the cases of humanitarian and other shocks like that, which is, highly concessional and that kind of thing. So I think what we want to do is support the continuation or expansion of such a facility because,
I find it hard to believe though that the answer to the so-called resources curse is to insure countries against the movement of the price of oil, rather than to encourage them to take a very responsible view about how to make the most of this resource over a long period of time. I mean
exactly.
But
if you have an exogenous shock, then
exogenous is different.
But I agree with you completely.
Right, last point, Paul.
Yeah. I mean, you can do both. I mean, when I was at the World Bank, I tried to develop the following idea, because it struck me the World Bank is lending huge amounts of money to oil economies, as an example, and it's also lending a huge amount of money to oil importing economies, and it's doing both at fixed interest rates. And so it struck me, why don't we try and get the one set of debts matching the other with basically oil price contingent interest rates, so that this would be not just win-win, which is the American way, this would be win-win-win, because the World Bank would never find itself in the situation of trying to get blood out of a stone. It would be asking countries to service their debts when they were flush. And that seemed to me to be
Where did you get with this idea? How did it get on?
It hit a rock, and of course, but the rock was that the lending to the oil exporting economies was on IBRD terms, and the lending to the oil importing economies was mainly IDA, and IDA and IBRD were in sealed entities, and so the IBRD people said, not on your life, don't contaminate our wonderful IBRD with that mucky IDA stuff. And that was the impasse. It was entirely internal to the World Bank.
But that means that you really could do it using the regional development banks, because they're now doing blended lending across their facilities. So that might be a practical thing.
Right. Yeah. Any last questions?
Sorry, can I have one observation on that, which is one could spend a lot of time talking about the World Bank and regional development banks, but commercial banking markets are much, much bigger. And the reality is the way we have gone with banking regulation, for completely understandable reasons, is very pro-cyclical on things like commodity prices. And therefore that will dwarf, even if you do some of these smart, I'm afraid to say, it's moving very powerfully in the other direction. And so if you want to think systemically about it, you need to think about that aspect of it as well.
Very good point. Thank you. That was an excellent session. I want to thank all the witnesses for coming and the very frank and clear evidence and ideas that you gave us. It's been a very good session. Thank you very much. Meeting closed.
Thank you.